First of all, as always, I must apologize by my English. I realized that I was the only non-English speaking speaker. So that's the second reason for apologizing is that, well, this is not my normal topic. So the title was given to me by James, and I was a little puzzled about these bridges and the mind of the universe that I knew, of course, but in the last years I have been working much more on historical research on science and religion with Tom and Mariano, on evolution, on Galileo, things like that. So I was thinking which can be my contribution to this homage, this memory of Mariano. And well, my idea was, following this title, just to try to explain how, in my opinion, the main lines of Mariano Artigas' ideas about science and religion came. So, why that? Well, the second or the third reason for apologizing is that the presentation you will have here is very, very short. It's just a small points of the things I will try to present here. But I try to use this presentation also to show a lot of pictures of Mariano Artigas. That could be one. So if you get bored by my presentation, you can just look at some of the pictures, and that will be it. Well, really, the pictures are taken just in, I think, in 2 or 3 places. Just 2 or 3 places. That's in the Pyrenees mountains, where we went often to walk and stay a little time, and in Boston with Tom Glick and some of them in Rome. But well, there are some nice landscapes and things like that. Well, when I first met Mariano Artigas 35 years ago. So that's another important thing. I was just starting then my studies of physics at the University of Barcelona, and he was a young priest and was the chaplain of the residence, the university residence, like Netherhall here, when I lived at that time, Colegio Mayor at Barcelona. We had several things in common at that time. He had a PhD in physics, so I was starting to study physics, so I get interested from this priest that was also a physician. We were both from the same city, Zaragoza, and so for this reason, both of us follow the Real Zaragoza football team. I must confess that I didn't follow it half as strongly as Mariano did till the last moment of his life. He was really very interested by football and all sports. And well, that was the initial reason of our knowledge. I didn't know anything about philosophy. He was at the time a professor of philosophy at the University of Barcelona. I was not too much interested in philosophy. But several years after, in 1991, we meet again, this time in Pamplona, when he was the dean of the School of Philosophy. At that time, I have shifted my professional career. I was a young priest myself, and I have obtained my PhD in philosophy of science at Rome, and I was starting to teach philosophy of science at Rome. So I went to Pamplona for a few weeks, a month more or less, in order to speak with him and get some advice about my new teaching in philosophy of science. Well, I am not trying here to tell my story. That's not the reason. But the important thing was that in that month, I had the occasion to witness in some way how the main ideas of one of his books, the intelligibility of nature, came out from all his other thoughts about philosophy of science. So at that time he has written a very important book. I think that is Filosofía de la Ciencia Experimental. Now it has been published in English as with the title Knowing Things for Sure. That was an exposition, a presentation of his main ideas of philosophy of science. It was, I think, quite original. He was following mainly the ideas of an Italian philosopher, Evandro Agazzi, but he was very, I think, dependent on Karl Popper and many other modern schools of philosophy of science. Well, but he was trying at that time to do something like similar in the field of philosophy of nature. And I remember that we spoke many times about how it would be possible to find a scheme in order to present a philosophy of nature that has not to be not only just a reproposition of the old Aristotelian philosophy of nature. Well, I remember I was seeing how his ideas came, and I remember that at the end of this month, he went in I think the last meeting, he told me, well, I have at least my scheme. He presented me an outline of the main ideas of the next book, that was La inteligibilidad de la naturaleza, the intelligibility of nature. And in a few months, just 4-5 months, the book has been published. Well, I think that this book is very important because I think that Mariano was following an important transition from his ideas in philosophy of science, philosophy of nature, to came at last to science and religion in the mind of the universe. That is, of course, the third book of this trilogy. I can say it's not really a trilogy, but well, I think that it's possible to find among these three books a kind of bridges that explain how his ideas of science and religion, and how to relate science and religion, came. So I will try just to present. Of course, I don't pretend to give here the right interpretation of Artigas' work. It will be, of course, my reading of it. But I hope that will give some light of the way in which Mariano was relating science and religion. Well, I think that the starting point is science as a human activity. So he was trying, in philosophy of experimental science, he was trying to reflect, first of all, about the different perspectives from which we can consider science. He thought that many of the contemporary schools of philosophy have adopted a very particular, very narrow view of science, as if it was the right view of science. So sometimes science has been considered almost exclusively from a methodological point of view. And in that case, science will consist mainly, for example, in a specific method, the naturalistic method, inductive, hypothetical deductive method, or something like that, or a nomological approach to reality, to explanation of reality, reduction, and so. Well, he has studied a lot at that time Karl Popper's, and for Karl Popper, science is almost only well, a logical framework in which theories has to be compared by their logical contents. Well, of course, method of science is a very important part of science. To consider logical structure of science is also important. To consider science as a paradigm or as a non-linguistic structure, as in structuralism and things like that, or a social construction, are of course several dimensions of science. But Mariano was interested in finding a view of presenting science that will not reduce himself to a particular aspect, but that will be able to present science in all the several and different meanings science has. Well, he has to start for something, and he let's decide to start for the idea of science as human activity. So that is something that is a part, and of course not the only aspect, not only the only part, but is a part of the way in which we relate ourselves with the world, with reality. So at the same way that we relate to reality, to the world, when we are doing politics, or where we are enjoying art, or many other aspects of our life, we are also relating to reality, to the world, and to the others, of course, through science. So we can repeat, but of course it's so common place, that science is what scientists do. So science is mainly something that we are doing because we are interested in achieve some goals. And I think that for Mariano that was an important main idea, that avoid reductivism in science, because in the history we can find that science has been built in many different ways with very different results, but always trying to do something particular to achieve some specific goals. Which are these goals? We have here these two goals. The two, for Mariano, these were intrinsic general goals of science. These two goals were the knowledge of nature and the dominion or control, experimental control of nature. With the particular and important point that these two goals are not considered as two different goals, but as two parts, two aspects of one unique goal. So for Mariano, knowledge of nature in science is pursued only through experimental control. And so this is the specific way in which we are obtaining a knowledge in science, different from the knowledge that we can obtain, for example, in philosophy, religion, literature, or things like that. And at the same time, the control that we are looking for in science is not just a kind of empirical control. I develop some abilities, some capacity to do things, to manage nature, but I am trying to control nature because I am trying to understand it. So and it's knowledge that make me control in science. So these two aspects are completely involved Well, adopting this perspective has, for Mariano, several advantages. Science is an intentional activity, is defined by these goals. And of course, this is a main starting point that after has to be complete, of course, with several other dimensions. The second main dimension for Mariano was scientific method, of course, and probably that will be the more important aspect in order to obtain an epistemological comprehension of science, to do philosophy of science, to try to understand science from a general point of view. And also the theoretical constructs. So science can be presented also as a set of logically related propositions about reality. Well, another, I think, advantage of this main idea to consider science as a human activity for Mariano was, I guess, the fact that as everything that is human, we must realize that science will have always a part of mystery, of something that is not completely explained, that we cannot completely, I will say, explain in front of us in such a way that everything will be perfectly clear. So we will have always some kind of mystery in the way in which we are reaching knowledge. And our capacity of know things is part of this mystery of nature. And I will say, most our attitude of permanent research from in front of nature is also a part of this marvelous aspect of human nature in the world. Well, this is the first point. I think that there is a first bridge from this point of his ideas of science, a bridge that can communicate science with metaphysics or philosophy of nature, if you want. That is the second part in the intelligibility of nature. What is this bridge? This bridge for me is the idea of truth. So in his study of his philosophy of science, that I won't present here, of course, I will present just a very, very concrete points. Mariano Artigas was trying to understand how it's possible to put together two main aspects of science. The first one is that in empirical science, we must construct the objects of our theories. So the constructivist aspect of science. Science, for the reason that is, because it is a human activity, something that we are doing, is something in which we are always active. Science is not just to observe the universe and catch some contents, some data that are clear and I will say that we cannot interpret, we must accept in only a way. But science is something in which we are trying to obtain this knowledge. We are trying to be able to control nature. And for this reason, the first aspect of science will be always the construction of the object. This is a part of his philosophy of science that depends very strongly from Evandro Agazzi, philosophy of science, the attitude that is called the realist objectualism, that is more or less known in Italy, not too much in, I would say, in other countries. Well, I will spend after that a few words more about the construction of the object. But the second aspect that for Mariano Artigas was important is that following this scientific method, we might obtain true knowledge of the reality we explore. So, realism. We found this union of constructivism and realism in Mariano Artigas' philosophy of nature. Well, which are the main parts of this? I'm sorry, that's I will present this. Well, about the I won't say too much about the construction of the object of nature. The main idea of Mariano was only the fact that when we confront ourselves with an experimental domain, with a problem, a physical problem, we have first of all to define clearly which are the aspects of reality that interest for our study. That is the idea that for Mariano is closely related also with some other currents of philosophy of science, that constructive empiricism of Van Brassen, but I think that the final ideas are different. And so his main idea is that we have to define which are the magnitudes, which are the aspects of reality that in which we are interested, in order to start to build a construction, a theory, a set of theoretical constructs that try to relate these magnitudes, these properties. So, for example, in space and time are empirical properties of bodies in Newtonian mechanics, can be considered from some schools of philosophy of science just an isomorphic, I will say, to appearances. That's the case of Van Frassen. Well, for Mariano Artigas, we cannot consider never that we have just in our concepts an isomorphic representation of reality. The concept has been constructed by us, and in many times we are introducing in these concepts ideal aspects. For example, in Newtonian mechanics, the absolute character of space and time have, of course, ideal characters, ideal features. Well, for this reason, for Mariano, the theory will be the result of the construction of this object, and that will give to our theories one very important characteristic, that is the strong, rigorous capacity to check every aspect of the object. So we can control every aspect of reality in experience in a very rigorous and very objective way, I would say, because we have defined the object in a very specific way from experience till the object, the general object of nature. So that's the content for Mariano of science, well, the starting point of scientist theories. But the second problem is truth. We have to obtain a real knowledge of things, of nature in science. That's one of the big problems of philosophy of science, of course, and Mariano tries to solve, also in this case, following the Evandro Ragazzi in many aspects, was trying to explain how science could really reach truth, a real and authentic truth, by this method. Well, considering first of all that science has to be considered in a very concrete way. So science is not, and this is the first point. Sorry, I will try to read here. Science has not to be considered as a qualification that can only be applied. I'm sorry, there is an error. So that which is totally, that which is totally independent of our ability to know and or active intervention. So one of the problems that we find in the concept of truth is that we are many times trying to identify scientific truth with a kind of absolute truth. So we ask for a scientific proposition to be true. We ask many times that, we can ask that in every possible circumstance and completely independently of our ability to know, or interventions, things like that, this proposition will be completely exactly an exact representation of reality. Well, for Mariano Artigas, that was a misguided conception of truth. For him, the starting point was the idea of consider that truth is primarily, he say, a qualification of our knowledge. So this is a very, I will say, a much more humble, much more low concept of truth. Scientific truth perhaps is not just the correspondence, the fully correspondence with reality, the capacity of describe reality as reality is in the world, but scientific truth could be so many times this qualification of our knowledge. So the fact that our knowledge can be called true if what we assert corresponds with the real situation we intend to reflect. So if my proposition, a scientific proposition, corresponds with the situation that I am trying to express in this moment, so in the specific context that probably is impossible to explain and to present in a complete way, because the content, as before we see the D.M. Quine principle, said that we have always an immense, great, an immense context of all our propositions. So, but if in the sense in which we are trying to say that, so we have to try to understand the sense, the meaning of my proposition. If corresponds to the real situation, my proposition will be true. This is not an absolute true necessarily. For example, in the problem of that was presented also of Copernican model of the solar system and Tychonian model of the solar system, we realize that mathematically they are completely equivalent. It's just a change of the system of the referential frame. But which were the meaning, the sense of these expressions in Copernicus' words and in Tycho Brahe's words? Well, they were different, really, because for Copernicus, the idea was that in this system, that for him at that time was just the universe was only the solar system, we can say. In this system, the sun has a specific position that can be considered as at rest in the context of the solar system. That's very different of the idea of Tycho Brahe, because in the context of the solar system, his statement that the Earth is at rest in the frame of solar system was false. Well, for this reason, Mariano was trying to explain how science, and in all his philosophy of science, he tried to justify that we can, in a very rigorous way, to defend that science can reach a referential, well, first of all, a synthetical, he called it a contextual truth, but also a referential truth. So science is speaking about a reality that is true, that there exists really, but also a semantic truth. What we are saying about reality is truth. But with the conditions that this truth has to be considered as authentic, is real truth, but partial, is not a fully representation of reality. Well, this is the main point. From this point, Mariano tried to build also a philosophy of nature. Probably that will be the main problem that we have been discussing from this morning in Bill Carroll's and in Stephen Fuller's presentation. So it's possible not just to have scientific theories that explain us how the world is, how the world works, but it's possible to say also that we are understanding the world in a different way, that we can call it metaphysical or philosophical. That was for Mariano Artigas the most important point. For him, without a metaphysical explanation, a metaphysical understanding of reality, we really won't reach a real compatibility, a real equilibrium between science and religion. So for him, science is the starting point, but we must to show that from, and Roger Trigg was speaking about that before, that from science we must to be able to find a more wide insight in reality, that is philosophy of nature or metaphysics. So that's that was one of his points. So metaphysics is possible. In modern philosophy, we find many people that are trying to say that metaphysics is possible, but with different meanings. For Karl Popper, for example, is not necessarily meaningless, but is not clearly very useful, except in sometimes. For Thomas Kuhn, all science has ontological presuppositions, so there are some metaphysical concepts behind all our scientific or our concepts, but it's not clear if these metaphysical presuppositions or ontological could have some or could be more important than just a common prejudice that we have about reality. In analytic philosophy, well, almost everything becomes metaphysics sometimes, because everything is discussed in a very general way. Well, what was the idea of Mariano Artigas? Not just to have a metaphysic, so a discussion general about very general and very big categories, but the problem was if metaphysics was relevant to science. So if there is possible to build a metaphysic that was in continuity with science and that was in some way a presupposition in order to understand theology. Well, in modern philosophy, I think that there are very few attempts to build a metaphysics relevant to science. Of course, one of these are Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy, that it can be considered like a metaphysics, a real metaphysics. And mainly in United States and in the field of science and religion, is many times a kind of philosophy that has been following in order to try to reach this bridge between science and religion. Well, Mariano Artigas was not in the line of philosophy of science, of process philosophy. But I will say that he was mainly Aristotelian Thomistic, an Aristotelian Thomistic philosopher. So we can consider also a second attempt, that is the Neo-Thomism or Neo-Thomistic attempt to show how an Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics agrees with contemporary science. Well, this is an attempt that has started a long time ago, at the end of 19th century, in Louvain with Cardinal Mercier, in Rome with Cigliara and several others, but mainly in the middle of 20th century, there were in Rome mainly several philosophers, Hennen, for example, or Selvaggi, Maritain, of course, is another case, that were trying to rebuild Thomistic philosophy in order to fill this gap between science and religion. Well, but I think that commonly, at least in the Roman tradition, so Hennen, Selvaggi, usually the strategy was a little peculiar. So the first point of their strategy was to try to separate Aristotle's metaphysical propositions from his natural science, realizing that natural science of Aristotle, so four elements and natural motions and things like that, were not more useful. Well, they were trying to extract metaphysical principles, I would say a philosophy of nature, that is a metaphysical philosophy of nature. Well, the second point will be to try to show, to deduce that these principles are important today. So to build a metaphysics, a philosophy of nature and a metaphysics, able to reach these metaphysical principles of Aristotle's, but from what starting point? From common sense experience. Because trying to think, well, that Aristotle's more or less has started from his common sense experience and he obtained matter and form, act and potency, and so from this common sense experience. Well, the third point will be very easy. We must to show that these principles that we have obtained from common sense experience are not in contradiction with contemporary science. Well, for Mariano Artigas, this strategy was not was not interesting. And he was trying of the different problems, the different propositions. Well, he was looking for something different. Of course, a possibility will be to try to build a philosophy of nature on the top of scientific theories. We must, and process philosophy in some way, I will say, is something like that. So we must to reflect on the content of scientific theories, relativity, quantum mechanics, things like that, and try to obtain from these theories a new insight on nature that will be a new philosophy of nature. But of course that has several problems. One is the provisional character of theories. We know that our theories probably will be surpassed in a few years. So our philosophy of nature will be very short-term attempt. The second, more important for Mariano, was that, well, when we realized that we have used an objectualization to build our scientific theories, well, we realized that we have in some way distort our comprehension of nature. So we realized that really our scientific theories start from something that is already, I could say, philosophically, that is a part of our objectivization. Well, the Aristotelian or Thomistic way start from common sense experience. For him, was not possible because yes, we have mainly because our common sense experience, and we can call it that way, is not the common sense experience of Aristotle or Newton or the people that will live in 2 centuries. So our common sense experience is different now because it has all the conditions that came from the full body of today accepted science. To put just an example, this podium or this table, for me, is not the same thing that it was for Aristotle or Newton. For me, this table is clearly a physical object that is subject to natural mathematical laws, that is composed by elementary particles in a very complex set of wave particles, and all the laws of nature. So, and really, when I am using this table, I am reasoning, and my experience is different of classical experience, because my view of the world has been changed by all that I have learned by science through all my instruction, all my life. Okay, for this reason, we need to realize, and that's the point for him, that we are always starting from a worldview. Mariano called it a Cosmo Vision, and that this Cosmo Vision, that worldview that we have and we cannot avoid at all, is dependent of all that we have learned in our life. So we are interpreting reality with this Cosmo Vision. So for Mariano, the idea was to start trying to think about which is the cosmovision, the worldview that we have today from natural science. Well, I won't explain here. You have it in his books, in part also in not too much, but a little explanation. There is also in The Mind of the Universe. But his main ideas was that nature for us is we interpret nature not as a body of substances that have accidents or properties, and that can or could be subject to changes, but nature is understood today as a completely embodied set of processes and systems. So we are in front of systems, we are in front of natural processes, and these two aspects present two main characteristics that are dynamism and structures. Everything in the physical world is dynamic, is subject to dynamism. Everything is structured in spatial, temporal patterns and things like that. Well, and from this starting point of view, he tries to build a philosophy of nature. These two aspects are closely related, he says, as natural dynamism is deployed according to temporal patterns and produce spatial configurations. So dynamism produces structures that in turn are a source of new dynamism. Structures, think to the atom, the molecule, a DNA, everything you want. Structures are a source of new dynamism deployed according to other temporal patterns, and so on. And we have a very organic, a very multi-level view of nature in which structures and dynamism, so processes and systems, are building all nature from the elementary particles to the more complex structures in the universe. Of course, it's clear that we have here a view of the world in which things like evolution, things like the dependence of mathematical aspects of nature are from the beginning a part of the way in which we are seeing, looking at reality. And from these points, Mariano was trying to build this philosophy of nature. That means to reflect with a more general view that in science, trying to find, for example, order in nature, to reflect of the meaning of the several aspects of order in nature as functionality, parameters, natural constants, principles of symmetry, principles of conservation, entropy, auto-organizations processes, and things like that. They are all ways in which we are discovering order in nature through laws and so. And through this order, and very quickly, I should find, and from this order, we can find also the levels of intelligibility in nature. Mariano distinguished between ontological dimensions and metaphysical dimensions. That, of course, is a specific way of presenting things. For him, ontological dimensions are these intelligible aspects of reality that will really obtain a philosophy of nature. So we can explain things following this aspect and trying to find, for example, the idea of causality, the idea of unity, individuality, and things like that, and concepts that will help us to understand these elements. Form and matter will be, for example, a part of these ontological dimensions, because everything in our experience has formal and material aspects. I will say information and substract structuration. And the metaphysical dimensions for him were exactly the way in which we can build the second bridge to religion, because for him metaphysical dimensions were these aspects that are in some way going outside the same natures. I mean, not because they will reach God. Metaphysics, or philosophy of nature mainly, doesn't reach God. That was not his intention. But because we are reaching that reality has some aspects, intelligible aspects, that are not a part of which nature is. So, I had here a phrase, but I cannot find it now, so that's the same. So, for example, for him, the idea that everything in nature needs of a transcendent cause. So, the idea that everything is not auto-sufficient, is not auto-necessary, that we have always some kind of contingency in classical terms. The idea that nature and everything has to be understood in terms of entity, being, essence, if you want, the ideas of potency and act, so that reality presents this double level in which we have something that we can call perfections and something that we can call possibilities, potencies, really potencies in nature. So these are not classical Aristotelian metaphysical concepts that we are trying to impose to nature. These were, for Mariano, metaphysical reflections that came from our understanding, philosophical understanding of nature as science is presenting to us. Well, I will just finish. I would like to finish just with a general remark about the sense of Mariano's philosophical trajectory. I have not been able to explain, of course, the real content. This was a kind of sketch. But he was actually trying to put together science and religion in a philosophical frame boiled around these two fundamental pieces: a critical but realistic philosophy of science, and a metaphysical but scientifically rooted philosophy of nature. In his views, I think that religion doesn't appear as a result of science, but philosophical reflection of science, and philosophy is another human activity. Philosophical reflection on science and on nature justifies the existence of a transcendent religious dimension of reality that can claim to have an important part in our views about the world and about ourselves. He used the term retrojustification because he considers that the existence and the characteristics of science and of nature would be impossible, would be incomprehensible without these transcendental dimensions. Of course, this is not a complete and final comprehension of the relationships between science and religion. It's an attempt that should be continued, of course. But perhaps it can be a way to better understand these two or these three dimensions of our life. Thank you. I'm sorry it's too late.
Well, I think we have time for 2 or 3 very quick questions. Sorry, yes. John. Professor Bly and then Professor Carroll.
Thanks for your talk. You said many interesting things. I'm curious how you get to truth beyond the observational data. You pointed to the example of Copernicus and the Lacanian model, but these two are observationally equivalent, and the issue there was which is at absolute rest. Is it the Earth or the Sun?
No.
And I wonder how you can reach the conclusion that the one was true, the other one was false. I realize the Roman Catholic Church has changed its mind on this issue.
I won't say that, but...
but well, it's interesting that in 1993, I think that's when the Roman Catholic Church reversed itself. 1993.
No, of course not. I'm sorry. Wow.
I think they apologized at that point.
No.
But it's very interesting that...
I could explain about that, but it will be a very different topic. Really...
all I wanted to say was that when they apologized, there was an editorial in Nature that I distinctly remember where the editor said, it's high time the Roman Catholic Church apologized. But of course, Galileo was much too good a scientist to believe the Earth moved in anything other than a relative sense. So science also seems to have reversed itself in that position.
No, just, okay. Yeah, well, about the... I'm sorry, I think that's not anymore necessary.
Okay, yeah.
That's, so I will say, well, about the historical point, in 1757, the general prohibition of Copernican books were cancelled from the index. So technically, from that time, there was no law in the church that forbid to publish books speaking about the motion of the Earth. So I know that in 1992 there were many headlines saying the church say at last the Earth moves, but that's not very exact. Anyway, but the important point is the other. Well, I have not tried really to explain the way in which Mariano is trying to understand how science can be said true in a semantic way. So an authentic but partial true. But in the case of the example that I put about Copernicus and Kepler and Tycho Brahe, that's my reasoning, is that from our point of view today, there is a context that made true one of these two propositions and not of models and not the other. This is the idea that we are considering the solar system as a system. So, in a system, you can consider if, from this reference point of view of the whole system, the sun is at rest or the earth is at rest. That's the point. So, today, from the point of view of the solar system, of course, the sun is at rest, not the earth. So I will say that that's the. I was presenting that only in order to say that that depends and can be true, can be false, but this truth needs to be explained in his context, in his full context. That in this case means that we are consider the solar system. I consider also that at Galileo times, that was the real context of their thinking of the motion of the Earth, of the sun, and of the Sun, because they were thinking of the universe that was more or less reduced to the solar system and some distant sphere of stars, of fixed stars.
Thank you. Thank you, Rafael, for that really, I have to turn it on. I have no idea.
It's on. It's on.
Sort of tour de force on Mariano's position. I noticed in the exposition, and it is in your exposition, and in the exposition of a number of other people so far, what appears to me to be a lack of distinction between philosophy of nature and metaphysics. Often you said a metaphysical philosophy of nature. Sometimes you then also talked about philosophy of science, which you do keep distinct. But I'm troubled about a failure to distinguish between philosophy of nature and metaphysics, and hence then the relationship between philosophy of nature and what we might loosely call the empirical sciences. Mm-hmm. So that Mariano, working in the Thomistic Aristotelian tradition, would he not want to say that a philosophy of nature is a more general science of nature that deals with questions such as what is motion, what is time, what is change, or does he want to say that those are already metaphysical questions? Because it seems to me that there's a lot of confusion between discussing a philosophy of nature and a metaphysics.
Okay, you are right. In my intention, I wasn't trying to distinguish between philosophy of nature and metaphysics at this point, because I was considering that for the discussions this morning and yesterday, I was thinking that the way in which for many scientists today and many people involved in science and religion, the real problem is the existence of some level of understanding of reality that is not empirical, and that is not just theological. So, for this reason, I put together philosophy of nature and philosophy and metaphysics, and I agree that it's important to make the distinction. Really, if I may explain my intention and my general view, I am not sure if in everything I said, but in the main part, was to speak about philosophy of nature. But, and this is the reason because I use the word metaphysics, a metaphysical, so a philosophy of nature that is working in a real philosophical insight. The second point, it will be, but that's probably we need to discuss after, is that, well, of course, in neo-thomistic and neo-scholastic metaphysics and philosophy of nature, there are two different positions. One that is considered philosophy of nature as metaphysics, and the people that I was considering, Hennen and Selvaggi, considers philosophy of nature mainly as almost metaphysics, so as a kind of special metaphysics. So metaphysical concepts applied to a special realm that is a natural world. And for them, natural philosophy is metaphysics applied to nature. From others, and mainly in the school you mentioned this morning, so in the American Dominican school, there is a strong emphasis, I think, in a philosophy of nature that is not just metaphysics, but is a real reflection, philosophical reflection on nature. I think that this distinction is right, is correct. I find only a problem in this position, but I never studied it very deeply. And this, the fact that I think that they are considered as concepts of Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy of nature, many aspects that were really part of their natural science, not their philosophy.
I'm sorry.